Good morning to all, and welcome to this session, this Meet the Author session, where we will be presenting a recent work by my colleagues at the World Bank on a very timely and very important issue on the distributional impacts of trade. My name is Pierre Sauvé. I'm in the World Bank office here in Geneva, and I will be moderating this session and giving the floor very shortly to two colleagues in Washington who woke up very early to be with us. Very much appreciate it. And then my friend Bob Koopman, the chief economist of the WTO, will provide some comments. Just for context, I'm Canadian, I grew up in Montreal, in a city where as a child, the leading source of employment was the garment industry. Today, the leading source of employment in Montreal hover more around education, higher education, computer software, aircraft parts, and machinery. And this would not have been possible without the orderly adjustment that Canada's commitment to trade liberalization progressively allowed. But of course, that structural shift in the nature of work and in the composition of our exports and our production was not seamless, and it was not costless, and it was not without distributional consequences. This is a topic that we have not paid much attention to in trade circles in recent decades, perhaps because we have lived for quite some time in an ideological moment where the Washington Consensus taught us that a sustained commitment to open markets created mostly gains for those who practiced it. And yet we've known from any student who studies trade, we know that there are welfare consequences to market opening that we should be sensitive to, that we should try to anticipate when we negotiate, and we need flanking policies to address the hurt that is inevitable, in some cases actually necessary. If indeed structural adjustment is to occur, we would not have the growth in trade and the reduction in poverty in the developing world if we had not seen the kinds of adjustments that I was able to bear witness to in my own hometown growing up. And Canada's progressive divestment of the garments and textile sector allowed countries in Central America and in many parts of the world to pick up that slack, with the impact on export growth and development that we have witnessed in many countries. Still today, we are in a difficult environment in which many question commitments to open markets, in which inequality has become rampant in many of our societies, both within and sometimes across countries, even though we've made very sustained progress in reducing poverty across the world. And so we need to pay more attention to how trade can be an inclusive source of sustained growth. And so this study by the bank is, I think, a very timely one and a very important contribution because it sheds light on country experiences. It also identifies a number of areas in which innovative empirical work needed to be developed. And it promises, I hope, to provide a framework for future studies in which we are better able to anticipate ex ante the distributional impacts of the policies we pursue and often advocate, and better design the policies that are required to mitigate the inevitable distributional downsides that are often associated to market opening. Enough from me. Allow me to pass the floor to my colleagues in Washington, two co-authors of the study, Gladys Lopez Acevedo and Marilla Maliszewska. Marilla, I think, will speak first and quickly introduce the book by showing a 2-minute video that does a very good job of showcasing the main findings and the motivations behind the work. And I will then give her the floor to start the presentation. Marilla, on to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to show you very briefly the video from the book, which I think really gives you a really nice introduction of what the report is about. It's just a couple of minutes.
How to make trade more inclusive. Trade has helped dramatically reduce poverty over the past 30 years. From 1990 to 2017, developing countries increased their share of global trade from 34% to more than 48%. At the same time, extreme poverty plunged from 36 to 9%. Trade has helped countries create new markets for their goods, increase productivity, and gain knowledge from trading partners. But while the benefits of trade are shared by many, the adjustment costs can be heavily concentrated, disproportionately affecting some sectors, types of jobs, and regions. Spreading the benefits of trade more widely is vital to increase shared prosperity in developing countries. The Distributional Impacts of Trade report provides data, tools, and new insights to make trade more inclusive. It looks closely at the impact of trade on wages, employment, and income of the poor in 5 countries: Bangladesh, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. It measures the impact of trade on labor markets and welfare. It provides data and tools to understand how trade affects workers and consumers. It provides guidance to governments on how to design policies to maximize gains and minimize the adjustment costs, helping workers adjust. Improving the business environment can reduce market distortions, increasing competition and productivity. Improving ports and roads, expanding access to finance, and harmonizing procedures can lower trade costs. Providing training and relocation support can enhance workers' employability and expand economic opportunities beyond urban centers. The right policies can support trade in becoming a springboard for growth and poverty reduction. The right policies can make trade work better for the poor.
I hope you enjoyed this little video, and I just want to thank you again, once again, for being here today. I know it's lunchtime in Geneva, it's bright and early here in DC. I hope you're joining us online and in person, and that you have lots of questions. This report has, it's a collaboration between several colleagues from the World Bank and outside the bank. You have 2 of the lead authors here present. 2 of our colleagues, Diksha Kogash and Jakob Engel, are also the main co-authors, and I'd like to thank them once again for all their hard work on it. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the report itself. First of all, why did we think it was worthwhile looking at this topic? Why do we think this is important? Why did we think it was important to write this report today? There are 4 key reasons. Firstly, this report makes the benefits of trade in developing countries more visible. And most of what we know about the benefits of trade comes from research in developed countries. There's a lot of data, lots of studies, but much less is known about the distributional impacts of trade in developing countries. And this report helps to redress that imbalance. Secondly, we wanted to have this as a reminder that trade and poverty reduction go hand in hand. As you have just seen in the video, the rise of international trade has transformed the global economy and coincided with a dramatic reduction in poverty. Thirdly, this report addresses the reality of trade. The benefits of trade are shared by many, but the adjustment costs tend to be concentrated in certain regions, industries, or affect certain types of workers. Now, what do we mean by adjustment costs? And while the evidence is clear that overall trade liberalization is beneficial to economies and societies overall, we know that some groups of workers tend to face temporary unemployment or lower income when their jobs are lost as workers reallocate to more competitive, productive sectors. And Pierre just has spoken about his hometown, giving us an example of how this transformation works. This is the adjustment cost that this report focuses on. And even though multiple studies have shown that overall trade benefits outweigh these adjustment costs, we know that more can be done to minimize these costs and to make trade more inclusive. Finally, what we wanted to do with this report was to provide policymakers with knowledge, data, and tools to understand better the distributional impacts of trade. So the report finishes with outlining the policies that can leverage trade to reduce extreme poverty, to boost shared prosperity, while minimizing the adjustment costs. Now, why is it important to look at this issue right now and in the midst of the pandemic? Well, while trade overall is seen positively in many parts of the world, protectionism and economic nationalism are on the rise. During the financial crisis, during the pandemic, there have been increasing calls for the production reshoring and trying to bring production back to home countries to raise barriers to trade. And this report is a response to protectionism. It's a reminder why trade benefits the poor and increases income of the vulnerable. This report comes at a critical time for trade. We know that trade is now more important than ever due to its vital role in production and provision of food, medicines, and vaccines during the COVID pandemic. It is, and it will remain essential to the economic recovery. However, the pandemic has hit the poor and women disproportionately hard, making the case for understanding and addressing the distributional impacts of trade even stronger. Now, very briefly, what is the value added of this work? So, as I mentioned before, we provide new findings on impacts of trade reforms in developing countries. We provide new data and new tools for measuring the distributional impacts of trade. This is based on empirical studies that are backward-looking, and we provide some forward-looking analysis as well. 3, we provide lessons for policymakers, how to maximize the benefits of trade and ensure that trade becomes more inclusive. And we provide ways to strengthen distributional focus in World Bank operations. So what exactly are we focusing on in the report? So we look at the wide range of outcomes. So we focus on different aspects of trade. We look at its impact on distributional impacts across time and space. So we look at backward-looking studies, how trade has impacted various countries over time and the distributional outcomes of it. And we look across space within countries, what has happened with trade liberalization and with the growth of exports and so on. We study a wide range of policy reforms, focusing on tariff liberalization, non-tariff measures, services. We look at the national and subnational level wherever possible, and we provide 5 country case studies, that is Brazil, Bangladesh, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and South Africa. And Gladys will soon tell you about the key findings from those case studies. And we also focus on a variety of outcomes. Trade often impacts wages, consumption patterns, formal and informal employment, and poverty and equality. And we try to understand how it affects workers, female, male workers, skilled, unskilled workers, and workers with different characteristics as much as the data allows. And that brings me to the new information that we had to generate for this report. As I mentioned, to start with, there's not so much analysis done on developed countries, and one of the reasons is the lack of information, lack of data. We try to remedy it partially by at least providing data for a subset of developing countries at the subnational level. So about last year, the World Bank has released Trade and Gender report together with the WTO. And as part of that work, we have generated gender disaggregated labor data set, which provides a set of statistics on employment and wages for female and male workers for developing countries. with this report, we try to go a step further and add the subnational data on wages and employment by skill and gender. And we're able to add 70 developing countries to that data set, and the effort is still ongoing, and we're hoping to add more countries as we work on new developing countries. What that means is that having the disaggregated data set at the subnational level, we can see, for example, that in Ethiopia, the urban gender pay gap is the highest in the west of the country. At the same time, tradable sectors are characterized by relatively low gender pay gap. So there is something to investigate there. Trade seems to be contributing to lower gender pay gap. But it's really in the Sri Lanka case study in the report where we illustrate the full usefulness of the data set for policymakers while looking at forward-looking analysis. So what we consider, there is a reduction of tariffs, non-tariff measures, and trade facilitation. And we study the impact of potential future trade policy changes on employment at the district level. We have information on employment and wages for female male workers for 25 districts. And we try to understand how different policy reforms could affect workers. What we find that the overall trade policy reform could lead to faster economic growth and poverty reduction. However, the gains in local labor markets could be concentrated in urban areas, exacerbating the existing spatial inequalities. It might also benefit in the absence of policy intervention and in the absence of course, other developments. It could rise to faster growth of skilled workers' wages, potentially increasing inequality within the country. But this is where we apply a different set of tools, backward-looking, short, medium run tools like partial equilibrium, and long run like computable general modeling with micro simulations based on household surveys to really look at the range of impacts over time. To sum up, the report provides knowledge, a very extensive long literature review covering studies focusing specifically on developing countries. It provides new data, and it provides new tools such as partial equilibrium, the heat model, such as long-run computable equilibrium analysis. And this altogether, knowledge, data, and tools can help inform policy responses to spread the gains from trade more widely, to make trade work for the poor. I'll turn over to Gladys, who can tell you a little bit more about the case studies and our policy recommendations, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Marila. Can you hear me well? Yes. So what are the new insights and findings from the case studies? The case studies provide a more balanced picture of the benefits and adjustment costs of trade in developing
We have a connection problem here. I don't know if Marilla, you can call Gladys or see whether she can reboot.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to call her right away.
And maybe not do the video portion, just the verbal portion. That might work.
He's trying to reconnect.
Marilla, are you in a position to cover some of the ground that Gladys was aiming to cover if she is unable to connect to us, or
Yes,
would you not do
right.
that?
We give her another minute, and if not,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry,
We
I don't
can.
know
Please
what
go
happened.
ahead.
Sorry, I apologize.
Gladys, maybe don't use the video because that's using the bandwidth. Just, I don't know.
No, I really apologize, colleagues. I don't know what happened. I mean, sorry. So I will continue. So as Marila was saying, the case studies provide a more balanced picture of the benefits and adjustment of trade in developing countries. And this is since the focus of the literature so far has been on developed countries. And I'm pretty sure you all have come across all this seminar work done by many colleagues in developed countries, highlighting the negative impact of trade on workers' employment due to greater import competition. And what is new in our report through the case studies is that sheds light on the type of adjustment costs, the channels through which trade impacts welfare, and the speed of this. So we have novel results on this. So I will highlight some important insights from the case studies. First, something that came very clear from this work is the need for more integration across geographical regions and across sectors. For instance, in our Brazil case study, a 10% increase in exports led to a 2.3% increase in employment and a 3.1% increase in average wages. The manufacturing sector attracted workers from other industries within the same micro region, but workers from other regions could not move because of prohibited large costs. So this is important. There were positive effects, but these effects tended to be concentrated within the same micro regions. In Mexico, we have a study highlighting the impact of Nafta. Municipalities more exposed to trade experienced an increase in labor force participation, labor income, and attracted more net migration, particularly of unskilled workers. However, these positive effects remain concentrated in tradable with little integration to non-tradable sector. When we presented these results, Marila and myself, in a roundtable with also the Minister of Finance in Mexico, they very welcome these findings because that's something they are trying to do is this integration between tradable and non-tradable and also across regions. Another important insight from our case studies is that policies needed to encourage opportunity and mobility. And why is that? Because, for instance, on one extreme, you can see the case of Bangladesh, where localities more exposed to trade experience an increase in wages and a reduction of informality. These positive effects spread through the economy over time and benefited other sectors. This is very novel in our work because this is one of the few studies which is able to look at long-run effects. In the case of South Africa, local labor market effects of trade were stronger in municipalities that included former homelands, but bear in mind that these former homelands had little economic activity beyond subsistence agriculture. So workers had few economic alternatives to move to other sectors. So these high mobility costs prevented them from seeking jobs in other regions and of course take opportunities. Another important insight from our work that is also relevant and is now a broad discussion in the literature is the relationship between trade and formalization. And here also our case study in Bangladesh provides important insights because we show that the export surge in apparel led to a reduction of informality, which was higher for women compared to men. For instance, a 100 gain in exports per worker led to a 0.7% decrease in informality in districts with a higher exposure to trade. In the case of Brazil, this is interesting, and this is particular also for Latin American labor markets. Informality acted as a buffer in the event of a negative trade shock that otherwise will have thrown people into unemployment. So what is another important insight from our case studies? Well, in this process, as Marilla said, we were able to develop tools that are extremely useful to assess the impact of trade policy on welfare. And these tools are also as part of the report in our webpage. And these tools were applied in the case of Sri Lanka. On one hand, there was this simulation that showed the potential effect of trade liberalization on consumption. This could be positive through lower food prices. However, the case study also shows that this positive effect could be awaited by the income gains benefited the well-off in urban areas the most, as Marilla has said. Some of these effects tend to be concentrated and might outweigh short-term gains. So how can these insights be useful for implementation? I think a comparative advantage or a value added, as Marilla said, is that by identifying in advance sectors and regions that could be most affected by changes in trade patterns, policies can be designed to maximize the gains from trade and mitigate adjustment costs. And this is what we try to do in the report, and this is what we try to show with the case studies and the tools that were developed. So how this can be useful policymaking. First is that the report contributes to this goal to follow, providing the tools, data, and approaches to design a smarter policy for inclusive trade. As Marilla said, there was a huge undertaking on this, and the information, tools, and approaches are available in our website with specific examples. And also the advantage of the report, it provides a framework that will help guide policymakers both in the planning, implementation, and mitigation. And this framework is anchored in 3 areas. First is reduce distortions. As we mentioned, in order for these gains from trade to spread, it is important to tackle distortions or failures that prevent mobility and could prevent firm entry and investment. Reduce trade costs, and here, Marilla, from the trade side, there is a huge agenda on trade facilitation and improving logistic performance, and speed up labor market adjustments, support workers in finding new jobs by addressing constraints to mobility and through social protection. And here also, the World Bank is collaborating with, several global practices in delivering a package that will support workers. What will take to establish a global trade policy agenda that delivers for the poor? One key measure should involve building a stronger and more effective multilateral trading system that could counter some of this protectionism that Marilla already mentioned and we discussed in the video. And now another important measure is, given COVID and the more frequent climate-related shocks, will be the urgent for developing countries to strengthen their policy frameworks and economic foundations for resilient, competitive, and inclusive societies. So the report highlights what can be done at the global level, the national, and country level. What are the steps that might be needed? And so what is the World Bank doing in applying this distributional lens? As Marilla said, we have the portal featuring the report, the background papers, and the tools and data that we hope that you can access and use and let us know, provide your feedback. Also, knowledge exchanges showcasing current analytical and operational work in this area, providing technical assistance in projects and operation. And just to provide a few of the examples we have working parallel to this report, Marilla has been leading a work on the distributional impacts of the free trade agreement in Africa to support the implementation of the 21 African countries. Myself, I have been working with teams on trade and local labor market through systematic country diagnostics, which is, a kind of a way on how to see the overall economy in Bangladesh, Egypt, and Argentina. And we are also working on a specific dialogue in countries in South Asia and in other parts of the world. So we really hope that this work is useful for you colleagues and for the policymakers. And as we said, it's the goal is to maximize the benefits of trade for the poor and minimize adjustment costs. And we hope that this report and the work that ensues the report will achieve this goal. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Gladys. I think one of the interesting findings of this study is concerns the lumpiness of the gains. We typically focus in trade classes in learning about the lumpiness of losses and the concentration of losses, but the findings that you report that tend to show that there are clear agglomeration effects at play that favor workers who are in urban areas and so on, clearly are things that policy must try to respond to. So I'm curious to know later on in the Q&A what recommendations we have in addressing precisely these kinds of impacts. I will give the floor now to Bob Koopman, who will provide his perspective, perhaps as an American, where issues of the distributional impacts of trade have had tremendous salience politically in recent years, spawning a very large literature in the academic world. But also as a WTO official, it's a bit paradoxical to be addressing the issue of the distributional consequences of trade in an institution whose liberalization function has been more or less paralyzed for close to a quarter century. So you can't blame the WTO for inducing liberalization, for liberalization-induced market opening that has dislocating effects. But nonetheless, the WTO is very much following these issues and interested to know what specific work Bob's team in the Economic Research Division is doing. Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. And I'd like to congratulate Marila, Gladys, Jakob, and Diksha for excellent report. Very, very timely and useful report for us, although I'm going to come back to the timeliness aspect in just a minute. So I have a story. I won't spend much time on it, but I grew up in a small town in northern New England that had textile factories and shoe factories. The shoe factories went to Asia. The textile mills went to the U.S. southern states. The impact on the local economy was the same, regardless of where the shoe factories going to Asia and the textile factories going to the Carolinas. The workers didn't follow. So this is a developed country issue as much as a developing country issue. But you're right. There's a lack of analysis and information on developing countries. And so congratulations for bringing this out and for producing these very interesting and illustrative case studies that show how it is very location specific. And it's important for policymakers to understand their specific conditions and how these effects may work through their economies. On the timeliness issue, around the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a fair amount of work on this, and including some at the bank, I think, that was looking at agricultural liberalization and trying to feed back these effects through certain countries using household survey data to get a sense on what the income and the expenditure consumption bundle expenses would be. At that time, I was at a place called the U.S. International Trade Commission, and we were doing reports to assess the impacts of free trade agreements that the U.S. was signing. We strongly advised the policymakers on the Hill and in USTR that the effects of trade policy were having significant distributional effects. And we proposed a set of modifications to our analysis that would include doing state level analysis to show the distinctions across states, household level analysis and labor market analysis that would show the various income and consumption effects. And we were told, no, it's a national policy. We want to focus on the national gains. So we continued to generate those national level effects in full knowledge that the distributional effects were quite variable depending on what region of the country, what sector of the economy you were working in, what was your labor skill characteristics, and those kinds of things. I think that was a big lost opportunity by US trade policymakers. And it's something I would encourage you as you engage in your discussions with developing countries, that they do embrace a more granular approach to the analysis of the impacts on their economies, and embrace the fact that you need coherence between your domestic and international policy environments. That means making some changes in your domestic policies, not just in your international policies. Now, we know as economists that this has been long understood. Trade economists going back to Heckscher-Ohlin and specific factors models have always basically said there are distributional effects. There are winners and losers. Increasingly, we've recognized that it's even more granular and more complex, perhaps, than even those simple models suggest. So I think it's important to realize that there are also many forces that drive economic change in the economy. And there are many margins of adjustment. And you started to look at one force, trade, and the many margins of adjustment as a result of trade. I do think it's very important to also put those trade effects into the context of other forces, whether it's technology or changing consumer preferences, those kinds of things, just to help put into context the role of trade versus other policies. But then please encourage trade policymakers, particularly in labor market adjustments, not to call out trade, but to view trade as one element of a set of forces that are driving changes in labor markets that all deserve some attention to helping with the adjustment. So I think these distributional impacts, great, very, very timely. I only wish that the profession had continued this back in the 1990s, late 1990s and early 2000s, and fully developed it. I told you my story about being told, no, don't go there. But the academic profession seems to have dropped it too. And now there's been a burst of literature around this, and it's timely. You guys are bringing it together, providing tools to show how you can use these in an applied policy setting. And it's just too bad that it's coming now when it would have been much more helpful earlier, but still, good job. Okay, so the biggest gains are dynamic. And at least from trade, in my view, the biggest gains are dynamic. I think you've done a good job on the comparative static. It's hard for me to understand more the dynamic aspects. You talk about retrospective and prospective analysis. But I do think more thought needs to be given to the prospective dynamic impacts. And that's really where these other forces can also come into play, and the need to better understand that. We at the WTO are trying to do work on that. Marilla, you're probably familiar with some of the work that my colleague Eddie has been doing, Eddie Beckers, in trying to look at the forces that drive changing comparative advantage and put that into the context of an evolving trade environment, particularly with the rise of digital and data. But I do think, again, going back, this looking across time, looking across space, looking across households, looking across labor markets, brilliant. Congratulations, keep building out on this work. And we can't wait to see more applications in more countries. And if you want to talk to us about doing some collaborative work in those areas, we'd be very happy to talk with you about that. We've got to make these the case for trade and trade liberalization more relevant at a more granular level. I'll stop there, Pierre. Thanks for the opportunity. And again, congratulations, Marilla, Gladys, Jakob, and Diksha.
Thank you very much, Bob, for those very insightful views. And you may have identified the next joint project we're going to do together as institutions. So that's very helpful. I think one aspect that I didn't really hear much about, and perhaps I'll just turn the floor back to my colleagues in Washington who may want to react to your comments, Bob, but also focus on some of the recommendations on the mitigation side. What policies do we recommend in addressing some of the labor market disruptions In the OECD era, in the developed country context, the mantra has typically been in virtually every country, perhaps except the United States, that has a trade-specific adjustment process that focuses on trade as a source of labor market distortions. In most other countries, the policy has been to favor active labor market policies. How feasible is that in developing country settings that are much more resource constrained among those that you've looked at? So that's one question. A second question I have for both of you, Marilla and Gladys, is how do we endogenize capacity for countries to be able to actually do this work themselves when they contemplate trade reforms, and not just rely on the World Bank to do it for them, but actually have capacity at the country level to do this work? So I'm just curious to know whether there is, in terms of follow-up work, a technical assistance component that will try to spread, if you want, the ability of countries to run the framework and the models that you've developed in this study. Let me turn the floor back to both of you first.
So let me go first. Again, well, thank you so much, Bob, for your encouraging comments. And when we had the discussion, when we launched the report, we had policymakers on the panel, and they kept saying, yes, but it's not just trade, it's technology, consumer demand, all these issues, the climate change, everything is affecting the comparative advantage of countries, the future trade flows, and indeed it's very complex, a heterogeneous issue, and we're not claiming that we've solved already all of those questions. We've answered all of those questions, but I think it's a good start, because trade is often has a bad reputation. It's like can happen that policymakers or certain workers who get displaced, the concentrated losses lead to those voices raising in favor of nationalist protectionists. So I think that's a good start, but you're absolutely right that there are big other trends that are affecting workers and that might have much more important impacts than trade. But we wanted to try to drill down and narrow what are really the channels that affect workers through trade. And we found some really encouraging examples and in developing countries that show the gains from trade. And that's coming back to something that Pierre has mentioned about the gains being concentrated. And I think Gladys can speak better to it, because she spent quite a bit of time focusing on Bangladesh and looking at the gains. But it seems really that the key to those gains being spread more widely, at least, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, was the mobility of workers and the fact that they were able to relocate quickly to the exporting sectors, to the exporting regions. And there were gains not only in terms of employment opportunities coming out of informal labor into formal employment, but also wages. However, that's also an example of the vulnerability of workers, because we know that those are the sectors that got hit especially hard during pandemic, and that employ a lot of female workers. So it just raises the relevance, the fact that it's a very relevant and timely issue for us to try to keep working on understanding on those distributional impacts on different types of workers and regions. In terms of the capacity, in terms of the policy recommendations that, and I will turn it over to Gladys as well to talk about it, because she's in the poverty team that works closely with social protection, so looking at the labor market policies. But what we try to strengthen in the report is this economy-wide approach that that there's a lot of issues that you need to make sure to really maximize the gains. There is need to reduce distortion and strengthen the functioning of markets. So the business environments, firms entering and exiting easily, supporting firms' ability to export through productivity growth or linkages to smaller firms, and also making sure that the consumers benefit as well. So on the consumption side, that there is there's no anti-competitive behavior, that there is for example, reduction of barriers to trade at the borders really gets translated into the lower prices for consumers. So there's really a lot that needs to be done. There's, of course, we and the trade team focus on the reduction of trade costs and barriers to exports and imports and logistics, trade facilitation, but of course the bread and butter of trade policy measures like tariffs, non-tariff measures, regulatory barriers to trade in services. But in terms of the mobility of workers, you mentioned the employment adjustment programs, and it's a very heterogeneous issue, and I agree that this is somewhere where you need to have the economy-wide perspective on workers as well. And we have a very good, I will turn it over to Gladys. I've been talking for a while, but I just wanted to encourage you to have a look at the report, or you can see it super well, but we have some copies in the room as well. But we have a very thorough literature review on what has worked in terms of those worker displacement programs in developing countries. And finally, I mean, I'll let Gladys talk about capacity building, because I know she's doing quite a bit in terms of training and embodying this in the World Bank work as well, in terms of so I'll turn it over to Gladys, and happy to come back to it.
Gladys, as I give you the floor, if you could just be mindful of time, we have about 12 minutes
Yes.
left in the session, and I would like to be able to also raise some questions that have come to us from the audience. So please do mind.
Only 1 minute. Thank you very much, Bill. Just 1 minute, just to complement what Marila said, and this is very important. We are making a huge effort in terms of raising capacity building. We are together organizing a seminar we have in November, focusing on the tools and data that were developed during this project, because I think it's very important, depending on the question, what are the type of tools that we have developed. I mean, for instance, as Bob said, well, okay, we have developed tools that allow us to analyze the trade effect along the income distribution, also along geographic areas, and then, of course, the focusing on the short and also on the long run. No, it's very difficult that only one model does everything, although I think the best case is Brazil. I think that's the gold standard in terms of approach, the idea, but it requires a lot of data to get there. So certainly, I mean, we can share, like invite the participants if they are interested on this technical seminar. And as Marila said, we are working with a lot of countries very actively in this area. I work on MENA, and we are doing a regional study on implementing this type of work. It has a lot of traction, but of course, as Marila said, we have to see the big picture. I think, as Bob said also, it is important to understand the structure of the economy in order to be able to understand the findings that we get, because there are a lot of market failures that will help us to explain why is that we see this. We don't see that the gains from trade are spread. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Just a few questions from the audience that I'd like to throw to you. Have you been able in the study to distinguish the differences between the distributional impacts of tariff cuts and non-tariff measures? This raises, of course, methodological issues which are challenging typically in the NTM world. Also, how much emphasis have you placed on distributional paths in service industries, which of course are very different from manufacturing, where they are driven typically by changes in tariff structures, whereas services liberalization actually rarely occurs. Services trade typically involves successive rounds of consolidation of existing practices. We call that liberalization, but it isn't in practice. So how do you address those differences? And we just had a session on the distributional, on trade and gender, where the WTO Gender Research Hub called for much more granular data on distributional consequences of trade on a gender lens, through a gender lens. So I'm interested in knowing what work you've done in this area. One final question is a question on accountability. How do we hold governments accountable to the knowledge that using this framework produces if they don't act upon the distributional consequences and do not do enough to mitigate the downsides of trade reforms? And this, of course, brings into play the need perhaps for a human rights perspective to trade reforms, which has been a very difficult issue for trade diplomats and for trade governance to take on board. So an interesting question from a political economy perspective: what if governments don't act upon the negative consequences of the reforms they undertake? Let me pass it back to you, and Bob, you're welcome to chip in if you want to.
So I'll go first again. So these are really good questions, and indeed there are really big challenges in distinguishing between tariff and non-tariff measures, just because it's so hard to measure those non-tariff measures, and we haven't really been able to find like backward-looking analysis that would try to do a good job at the global level of trying to distinguishing those impacts, or even at the country level. Backward looking, it's just hard to measure. And so when we looked at reforms in South Africa, Bangladesh, Mexico, Sri Lanka, this is only in the case of Sri Lanka where we're able kind of to disentangle the different impacts with an imperfect methodology still, but just going forward, trying to see what the distributional impacts of tariffs versus NTM reductions are. But definitely more needs to be done in that area. We've done some work in the report, but I feel like going forward, this is really where we'll be focusing a lot more. And the same goes for services. I think those country case studies that were done, they were not commissioned for the report. There were bits and pieces of work from different World Bank projects. But we now have a report on trade and services, which I think Pierre is also involved. So that's where we really want to focus more on the distributional impact of services. And this is again where the big data effort is taking place to be able to answer these questions more accurately. So yes, ongoing work. And in terms of the human rights perspective, I would love to hear what Bob and Gladys have to say, and if they have some thoughts on this, because we've already, this is something like that's already, or Pierre might also have some suggestions, because there's the issue of free trade agreements that cover now the labor rights and other policies. Would love to hear your take on this.
Thank you very much, Mari. Yes, just to complement, as Marila said, I think something very good about the report is that it identifies the question and then the approach to answer these questions. As Marila said, some of these case studies follow the methodology Author and Hansen in terms of, exploit a natural exogenous shock, no? And this exogenous shock, it has to do more with changes in tariffs, or a surge in exports, a reduction of imports. So something exogenous we were able to exploit in the case of Bangladesh, Brazil, South Africa. And we did it before in the case of Sri Lanka. So what is very novel here, or new, is, as Marila said, the case of Sri Lanka, it's a great case study because it's able to bring the methodologies in one and try to help us to understand the short, medium, and long-term effects of trade liberalization. On terms of the last point, yes, we are, and we have a seminar next week precisely on this issue of globalization and labor, because it's also a fascinating topic on which we didn't dwell so much attention here, but it's a lot of ongoing discussion. We have a colleague from ILO also participating in this group. And so, but definitely what we see in all these case studies, because I mean, it became very clear in the case of Bangladesh and also in the case of Egypt, is that it was very interesting to see that the largest decrease in informality was on women. So, I mean, so certainly there is an association between, more trade and improving the female labor participation, reduction of informality, increasing wages. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to make a last intervention, or are you okay?
Very, very quickly, Pierre. DG Ngosi's talked about how making sure trade serves people. I think it's interesting because trade tends to be viewed as serving workers and consumers differently. And in reality, it's not clear to me that they do. It does. It can have different effects in those sectors, but there are these other forces that are driving those things too. And I don't think we want to make it about labor versus consumers. I think we want a more complete and fuller understanding. She's also emphasized the need to make sure that trade debates, are based on knowledge and facts to inform those debates. And I think the kind of work that the World Bank has laid out here helps provide the knowledge, facts, and insights to make sure it's an informed debate. So again, congratulations. I'll close with that.
Well, I'm not the one who would disagree with that view. That's what we try to do, bring some evidence to bear on complex policy debates. It's always a work in progress, and we always try to improve our analytics and our work methods. I'd like to thank all of you for this rich conversation. We were about 110 people at its peak, which shows that even during lunchtime, there is an appetite for the substance that this kind of analysis produces. Other questions were raised, and I would really encourage my colleagues to take a look at the chat box and see if you can address them, if it's possible for you to respond to those who ask questions and we were not able to answer them. But let me thank you once more, congratulate you, join Bob in congratulating you for this great piece of work. And I hope we soon have an opportunity for you to actually come to Geneva to engage in this kind of discussion and perhaps identify future areas of work because there is a clear need for